welcome to another episode of Disaster Empire Quick Views. This is the podcast where we talk to thought leaders and innovators in resilience. And this may be a familiar face if you have been watching the podcast. I am really happy to have Jeff Dow back on with me. We promised each other from the last podcast that we'd have him back to talk about crisis leadership specifically. So Jeff, thank you so much and welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
All right, we're going to dive right in. So again, great to have you back. And when we talked last fall, we want to talk specifically, as I said, about crisis leadership. So thanks for coming back on, and let's jump into your thoughts on the matter. So what do you feel are attributes for effective leadership?
So I think that's a question that has a wide range of attributes, kind of depending on your focus. So I pulled out a few that I think are important for crisis management, crisis leadership. But I think these are also just good leadership behaviors, tenets, attributes. The first one that I think is the most important thing for a leader is you just be present. And whether that, in a remote environment where we are now, there's a little bit more of a challenge, but tools like what you and I are using now, Teams, Zoom, things like that. But be there for your teams, be in front of your teams, let them have access to you. I think that is so important because if you're not there for the little things, they're not going to come to you for the big things. So just how are they doing? And it's not just, do you have capacity? Are you able to do what work you need to do? But how are they doing? Like, I have a person right now that is down pretty hard. He's got COVID and bronchitis at the same time. He missed some things we're going to do. The CEO just happened to bump into me. I don't really know him well, but he knows what I do. Asked me how things are going. I let him know that my guy was down hard. The CEO emailed him. I mean, to me, I think that speaks a lot of our company, but also I just want to let him know that, hey, this guy is down, and he let him know. So I thought that was really good. So be present, I think, is an important one. I truly believe the core attribute of a leader is to be able to make decisions, especially in a crisis, right? That is absolutely critical. And I love to watch shows. I love to watch TV, and it's probably not difficult to think that I like to read and watch military history. I was in the Coast Guard for quite some time. So they're out of movies. They're not actual quotes, but in the movies or in these programs, there are two quotes I think are really important for decision making. One was from Band of Brothers in the episode called Bastogne. And the first sergeant said about a leader, he wasn't a bad leader because he made bad decisions. He was a bad leader because he made no decisions. And I think especially in crisis leadership, you're not always going to have all the information that you want or even need. And sometimes you just have to make the best decision you can at the moment. And if it's the wrong one, well, then you now have that data point and you can pivot. So I think that's really important. And then another one was from a movie in the 70s that my father took me to when I was probably 6 or 7 years old, Midway. Not a great movie, not very good history, but there's a great line in it where Admiral Halsey is talking to Admiral Spruance, and he said, Spruance was telling Halsey, like, look, you're down and out. You're not going to be able to go on this mission. I'm taking over for you. I just not sure what you would do. And Halsey looks at Spruance and he says, when you're in command, command. And I think that's important. When you're in a leadership role, you have things you need to do. And one thing that I learned early in my career, I had some very good leaders early in my Coast Guard career. And I was very fortunate to get command of a patrol boat in the late 90s. And for the first, couple months, I kept thinking what would Lee Ramosko do in this situation? Or Fred White or Dick Kermit? And then I realized, I can't lead or command my ship the way I think they would do. I just had to trust the lessons I learned from all of them will govern the decisions that I'm making. And so I think understanding kind of where you come from will help you make those decisions. Just a couple other ones. When I was going to that ship, the commander that I reported to, he was a pilot. And he asked me to come to his office. He wanted to talk. And I'm thinking, what is a pilot going to tell me? I'm a ship driver. This guy's a helo pilot. Come on. And I couldn't have been more wrong. Commander Martin was excellent. And one of the things he asked me, and I think it's really important when you're dealing with crises, he said, what are you going to do the first time your crew fails? I was like, what? It just didn't dawn on me. And he goes, it's going to happen. And he said, your reaction to failure is probably even more important to how you react to success. And I think that's really important in crisis management. We talked about making decisions, and a crisis team, like I report to during a crisis, or a leader, you're going to make some wrong decisions. It's going to happen. But if you're not willing to do that, and you're not willing to be able to talk to your boss about that, you're going to be paralyzed. And that leads to another one. You have to learn to be able to say no to people. And no to me is a bigger overarching. It's not just, I'm not going to do this, but how are you able to give solid advice to the people that you report to? In our case, our crisis team reports to the executive team, the executive vice presidents. And there are going to be times they're going to have to give them bad news. And it's no different than a individual having to talk to someone else. And that's, I think, really important, that ability to talk, to give frank advice, to give frank opinions to the people that you work for. And then the final one, I think it kind of goes with be present. And that's why I wanted to bookend this answer. The mentor I had in the Coast Guard, his name was Fred White, and he was the executive officer on my first ship. And I learned so much from him. And I was going to command another vessel that Fred was the CEO for. He was the first CEO of this boat. And I visited him. He'd been retired. He opened opened a branch of a consulting firm in Charleston, South Carolina. They had this amazing office right over the main street in South Carolina. And he gave me a tour, and he took me to the corner office. I said, Fred, you have made, like, this office is amazing. He goes, well, that's not my office. And he took me to his office, which was good, but it was not much. I was like, what? Why don't you have the corner office? And he looked at me and goes, it's not about you. And what are you talking about? And he had done a tour on a Marine base, and that was a quote that they use quite a bit. And it really is quite simple. It's not about you as the leader. What are you doing for your people? And he goes, I don't need that office. And this guy has worked really hard for me and for this company. He's got the office that he's earned. And so that has stayed with me, I hope, my career since then. So I really have to make sure to understand it's not about you. And when you're in a crisis, ego has to go out the door. It has to be about making sure that you're managing the crisis, or you're responding to the crisis in front of you, and you're making sure that the people that are impacted, they're getting taken care of. And so those are the ones. Be present, make decisions, understand what you're going to do in failure, know when to say no, and it's not about you.
Thank you for that, Jeff. And I just wanted to hit on a couple elements. One, first about our CEO that you were talking about, and having that personal touch goes such a long way, because I don't know about your experience, but I've seen in some companies, there's a big divide between the senior leadership and everybody else, right? Even their line, managers. So, I think that showing that personal care, especially now, is so important. Not that it wasn't ever always important. And I think the other piece that you talked about is in that crisis leadership space, or leadership in general, and that it's not about you, right, at the end of the day. And I think that's a key piece for ego. You need to be, I think, a strong enough personality to be able to lead, and to be able to be, I call it, a servant leader, right?
Yep.
But that the spotlight is not meant to be on you, especially on a crisis. It's on getting people back to work, and especially keeping them safe and
Absolutely.
and all of that. And you were saying that more eloquently than I just did. But but let's dive in a little bit deeper, because I think there are some attributes, and I'm not saying that all leaders don't have some of these, but I think there are some that are particular to leaders who find themselves in a crisis situation, and, as you said, are leading a crisis team. One of those things that I think is very helpful is having that presence, and also having that ability to not show extreme stress under pressure. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. And what do you think, just diving in a little bit deeper, are those attributes that are specifically helpful to someone who is leading a crisis situation?
Yeah, I think the one of the most important ones that I think, going back to decision making, is the ability for whoever's leading that team. You need to analyze information in front of you very quickly. And I read a book probably, it must have been 2006, maybe, or 2004, 2005 rather, a biography on John Boyd. He created the OODA loop, or OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. And to me, that is probably the keystone in crisis leadership. I am not going to say I'm an expert on what Boyd created. He was brilliant when it comes to things like this. But in my mind, and what I try to talk to our executive or our crisis team is, you have to take in the information quickly, analyze it, and then making that decision is really important. But I think sometimes what people forget, and you can decide, but then putting that decision into action, that's tough, because as the crisis team, at least the way we have it set up, the crisis team relies on other people to execute on their decisions that they make. Being able to monitor that, understand what's happening, and then go back in and update, change, review your decisions, and continuing that cycle, I think that is probably one of the most important pieces of crisis leadership. And I mentioned earlier in one of the ones I was talking about, there are going to be times in a crisis, especially a fast-moving crisis, that you don't have and you won't be able to get all the information you want, and you're going to have to make a decision. And I think, when I was in the service, especially on a ship, very dynamic environment, that is something you need to do. My experience so far with working in corporate America is sometimes that's not easy for leaders to do, because things don't typically move at the pace that they would in a crisis. Yeah. And so I have found that the opportunities I've had for large crisis situations for our company, COVID is the one that comes to mind. I'm sure, everyone in our role that's probably watching this had to deal with COVID with their company. And I was impressed that, we had people making decisions quickly. The easiest one to talk about was, I think it was March 11th or 10th of 2020, moving everyone to home, work from home. And our CIO was part of the crisis team, and he wasn't 100% sure how the network was going to react with everyone doing that. But it was his call. He said, we got to move everyone home. And that wasn't the EVPs, that wasn't the CEO. The crisis team made that call, took that decision to the executive team as they were putting it into place. And that's important. And I think that's to me, a really good example of how that crisis team moved and reacted without having all the information, but they knew the right thing to do was to keep our people safe. And again, you went through this in March of 2020. The only thing people knew how to keep people safe was to keep them at home or keep them as far away from people as possible. The crisis team understood that, made the call, and then figured out how to do it. And that decide act, they had laid the groundwork with leaders throughout the company and put that in motion. And I thought that was pretty impressive. So I think it's that ability to make decisions. And it's not, I say all the time, sometimes I'm not well suited in the civilian world. And I think we talked about this. I am a ready, fire, aim kind of person. And that has served me well at times. And at times it hasn't. I think you have to balance that ready, fire, aim with actually ready, find out what you need to do, and then execute. So maybe it's, it's ready, aim, execute. And I think that's what a really strong leader will do. And again, like you had mentioned, you're going to be getting this. You can't let it grind you down. You can't let people think that you're not able to function in the crisis role. So we could probably talk about this in another whole podcast, just that whole aspect of crisis management.
Absolutely. Yeah, I definitely hear you. And I think that is definitely a key attribute. And I think it's one that can be learned. It's having that comfortability, if you will, of being able to make decisions without having a full understanding of the landscape, because that's what I found to be the biggest reality from and learn that in the public sector as you did, right? Coming into the private sector, that it is very challenging for many of the leaders that we work with, because they have so much data available and they have that luxury of time that you don't have, especially as you said, in a fast moving crisis. COVID being a great example in the early days of needing to make that call about keeping people safe, thinking about their lives versus, profitability of the company coming foremost, although that's important too, because you want to be able to continue operations. Right. So, it was, hard decisions that were being made during that time, and they're made during other events, as well. So I think those are definitely key points. And that's something that is not the norm, as you said. I think you and I are alike in terms of our temperament, because I will just jump feeling confident, right, with the decision in my BAU, right? Whereas sometimes others have to pull me back and say, okay, let's consider this a little bit more, because I'm like, okay, let's
Agreed.
go with what we've got. And they're like, no,
Agreed.
wait a minute. We
I've got
need to
a
think about it a
team.
little bit more. But yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit more about that, because as you mentioned, a lot of your kind of early thoughts on leadership have evolved from your time in the Coast Guard. And, how did those really inform your thoughts on leadership? And anything else that really stood out to you and you found helpful that you did carry into the
Yeah,
work
I would
world?
say, from a crisis standpoint, skills I learned, or the attributes that I think I worked on in the service, I think work at them differently in corporate America than in corporate world than you would public sector or the military. But I think those are transferable skills, like you said, and they're learned, right? So I absolutely believe that you apply them differently. And again, I think that ready, fire, ready, aim, execute, or ready, execute, aim. There were times probably on some of my ships where I really just needed to make a quick decision. That has been a big learning. And my current manager, his name's Jim Demholm, I am confident there are times where he's had to ease me back into, okay, I hear what you want to do, but let's think about it a little bit. He's excellent at that. But there were two things that kind of stood out from an actual crisis. And there was, in 1991, there was a pretty massive Haitian migration leaving the country. It was around Thanksgiving, November, December of 91. And I was on a ship not really designed for a law enforcement mission. That's not what we did typically. And we got diverted. We were working out of Puerto Rico. We were home ported in Florida. We got diverted to assist. And, I got to see Lee Ramasco and Fred White really understand and grasp the gravity of the situation. These are human beings that we have to take care of in a very difficult time. And we just were not designed, nor we were trained to do that. And I just really saw them attack the problem. And I was really impressed. And let me tell you, never once thought that they were under stress, that they probably were. I was an ensign. I was not even a year out of the academy. Mm-hmm. And I learned that. And I'd like to think that, so in 2007, I was in a similar situation in the Straits of Florida, where there was an influx of Cuban migrants coming up through the Straits of Florida. I'm not sure I handled it as well as Fred and Lee did, but I had an excellent XO and operations officer. We were on a ship that probably a little better prepared for missions like this, but again, wasn't our primary mission. I'd like to think that I took the lessons I learned there of things that we needed to do quickly. How do we get our crew trained? And really allowed, I hope anyways, allowed the staff, the XO ops and first lieutenant engineering officer to do what they needed to do to prepare the ship for, again, a very difficult mission. And again, these are human beings that are going through a difficult time. And so I think I learned a lot from that. And there are transferable skills, how you plan, how you execute on your plan, how you change your plan. Again, in our world, I tell people all the time, your BR plan will probably last about 3 minutes into a real, actual disruptive event, but that shouldn't discourage you. The planning that you go through, the thought process that you go through, the people that you talk to, all of that will be valuable. And I think that's something that I definitely learned on those two incidents and moving into business resiliency, business continuity, and then crisis management.
Definitely made me think, and that ability to pivot when I was working for the state of Massachusetts and, for Katrina, then Governor Romney welcomed in guests from Katrina, and they were airlifted by FEMA right to the base in Bourne in Massachusetts. And so we had our plan, we had an empty hangar, we had our plan for how we were going to receive people. But the moment that people stepped off that plane, in tears, still covered in mud and just dealing with everything they were dealing with, right, for the last few days coming into our environment, we definitely had to pivot. And it's a, testament to leadership that they stepped up and made the appropriate changes when they did. So I love that, thinking about flexibility. Mm-hmm. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, I know, but also leaning on the right people in your team. And you alluded to the leader doesn't have to be doing and executing on everything. They're relying on good people to do that work and setting that vision. So let's talk a little bit more about, because I'm seeing a lot, kind of out there on socials and academia, and about hard and soft skills. And you were talking a little bit about this, but what are the ones that really stand out to you to being key, particularly for crisis leadership?
And it's a great question. And in my mind, skills are skills, right? There are things that a leader is going to be good at and things that they need to improve on. It's how I think you incorporate those skills into your leadership style that in my mind is important. You have to know your strengths and weaknesses. And sometimes, there are people that have pretty good hard skills, whether that's technology or analyzing data or, collecting data. I've got a really good friend that is, his name's Matt, unbelievable with Excel and technical things. And I rely on him on some of the decisions I had to make when he and I were team leaders together. He's phenomenal at that. I think when you talk about those soft skills, that's a little bit what I was talking about, be present. That's a hard one to quantify. I can't tell you if you do these three things, then you're going to check the box. Being present for you as a leader might be different than for me. I think it also depends. You have to know, are you an extrovert, an introvert? How are you going to interact with your team? The other thing is, from being present, you have to know your team. I had one person when I was in a team leader for TruStage, now TruStage, and she hated recognition, hated it. Didn't want anyone to, even an email saying good job. That's just not what she liked. And she was a great worker. A tremendous worker. Mm-hmm. And I had to understand, the first couple of times I did that, she kind of, okay, thanks. And just kept going. But then we had an opportunity to talk, and that's just not her thing. Maybe if I had been better at being present, I would have understood that sooner. But I think that's part and parcel. You as a leader have to understand, in this particular crisis, my team needs a little bit more moral support. Or my team in another crisis, we don't have enough radios. I'm going to get radios for you right now. And that may not be a hard skill necessarily, but that's a skill that you have to go out, talk to procurement or whoever, or make the decision to take your credit card and go get the right radios that you need. So I think it really kind of depends. It's very situational, right? You have to understand what you need to do and then apply those skills appropriately for your team. No, that's the challenge.
Not an easy job. Well, hey, you posted something on LinkedIn, and I'm going to look down to make sure I get this right. Sure. And it really resonated with me. Aligned with this quote, does the captain have to be the best ship driver? No. The captain has to know who the best ship driver is. And for me, it really spoke to the fact that leaders don't have to be the best at everything, like we were just talking about, but really leverage those around them for the best skills. So why do you think this is vital for crisis response?
So when you get assigned to be either an executive officer or a commanding officer for the Coast Guard, there's a 2-week school that you go to. It's in New London, where the Coast Guard Academy is. They just go over, it's a lot of technical, legal types of things. You do some simulators for ship driving. You talk about some things, and you're in a class of, probably 12 to 15 other, very type A personalities. These are people that are going to be XOs and COs. And I believe his name was Andy White.
Top gun at the Coast Guard level.
A little, I wouldn't, maybe not quite that but similar, right? And I think it was Andy White. I think that was his name. And he was sort of the lead instructor. And I don't even remember which class this was. And he posed that question. And, the reflex thing, and a lot of people assume that the captain of a ship drives all the time. They're the one, but you don't. That's not your job anymore. And that has resonated with me since he said that. And I've always tried to understand, the lead, like you said, the leader doesn't have to be an expert, but your job, going back to being present, is to know your team's strengths and opportunities and then put them in the right situations. I've got a person on my team that, thank goodness, he enjoys doing the technical side of the access control systems and cameras. And he'll tell me a problem. I'm like, okay, go fix that. But he's very good at it. And and it's vital for our company. And it wasn't hard for me. I have to be honest. It didn't take a genius to figure out how good he was at this stuff. But I have some other guys that are, enjoy being in front of people, and another, he manages events. And then I've got another guy on my team. I have three gentlemen on my team. His unbelievable strength is his network and relationships he's built at TruStage. And again, as you can imagine, in crisis management and business continuity, being able to go up to someone quickly and say, this is what we need. Again, it wasn't hard to diagnose. My three team members are incredible. And I just really just have to sit back, make sure that they don't have anything in the way. To me, that embodies what Lieutenant White was trying to say. I'm not an expert in all of those things, but I have a team of, I believe, really good people that I just let them go do their thing. And, the job gets done. And that's important.
Absolutely. Well, hey, I know you and I could talk about this all day and probably have you back on again at some point to talk about and dive into deeper to what we talked about earlier. But hey, who is the leader that most inspired you and why?
I've mentioned, Lee Ramosco, Dick Kerman were two incredible leaders. There's Commander John McCann, but the two that really stand out, Fred White, again, my mentor in the Coast Guard. I learned, like everything. I would say, and I was 22, 23 years old. I got to work with him for a year and a half. I think a lot of how I manage and how I lead is a reflection of what I learned from Fred. And then the other one, and I'm not just saying this, but my current manager, Jim Denholm, he's a vice president in HR. I would put Jim up with the best leaders in the Coast Guard I've ever worked with, top 3 or 4. He helped me through a really tough time a couple years ago during COVID. I feel I can talk to Jim about anything, both, if I've got things going on personally, but also if I need to tell Jim, like, Jim, I don't think this is what we're supposed to be doing, I get to say that to him. And I think, and he takes it in and he'll evaluate. And I've learned a ton. Excuse me. So I would say Fred and Jim are, again, the gentleman I already named, unbelievable leaders as well. I've got a friend at work. Her name's Amy. She is an incredible wealth of knowledge about how the company operates in kind of inside baseball. Right. I get a ton of learning of her. She's not an official leader anymore, but she leads teams without being their formal leader, which is a very different style of leadership. So I've been very blessed to work with some incredible leaders in my career.
Well, hey, thank you for that. As we wrap up, there anything else that you want to share with this audience that we didn't get a chance to talk about on this topic?
Well, I'm just glad that I'm able to do this. We've known each other now for maybe it's a couple years. We're working on other things together. I really appreciate the opportunity. I learn a ton, even just from all of the things that you do. So thank you for that. I really do appreciate. And I know in the past you've asked the best way to get in touch. I'm on LinkedIn. You could probably get it through your profile. You could search for me for Jeff Dow. Be happy to engage and talk. I could talk about leadership for a long time, and I learned a ton of how you do that. I'm a firm believer that leaders have to be learners throughout their entire career. I like to read books, and I've gone to DRI, and there are degrees you can get, but I love learning about how other people learn their craft and then how they apply it.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff, for coming on. And thank you to the audience for being with us today. Yeah, great to talk to you again about this. Is one of my favorite topics. And like you, I'm always looking to learn more and be better. And I know this audience is as well, learning about different topics. So I completely agree with you about the lifelong learning. So it's not just on the topic at hand that I'm focusing on, but many things as well. So that I think help inform, who we are when we're in those leadership roles. And then just as professionals and being better at our profession, sometimes I'm picking up things from things that aren't even directly related, to security or business continuity or safety or anything else, because there's so much to learn out there. Thank you so much. It was so great having you on again.